Dear participants, I'm pleased to welcome you to this session on sustainable supply chains reaching the lower tiers, organized by the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, or ESCAP, in collaboration with the International Labour Organization. My name is Marit Nilses, and I work on responsible and sustainable business at the Trade, Investment and Innovation Division of ESCAP. I will be co-moderating this session with my colleague Fredy Guyacan, who is managing the ILO program on responsible supply chains in Asia. Supply chains have become the predominant way of organizing production and trade, as we know. About 80% of global trade today takes place within value chains linked to transnational corporations. This trade-led growth has brought substantial economic development to many countries in the Asia-Pacific region, which has become a global powerhouse of production, with many jobs now linked to production that forms part of multinational value chains. However, the often arm's length model of production that is associated with the offshoring and the outsourcing, and the many tiers involved in some supply chains, can make it difficult to discover precariousness at lower levels. And the social and environmental inspections and audits are often focused on higher tiers, while high cost pressures squeezes margins. So with that background, this session will discuss some of these challenges and some of the potential solutions for promoting responsible and sustainable business practices in the lower tiers of supply chains. It will look at incentives for buyers and suppliers to ensure that the principles are maintained, share experiences of companies, and discuss potential solutions to address these challenges, including some of the initiatives that can support companies in understanding and addressing the challenges of both social and environmental issues in lower tiers. And addressing this it's important for many SDGs, sustainable consumption and production, climate, decent work, areas where this region is off track for achieving the SDGs. But before we begin, let me first hand over the floor to my co-moderator, Fredy Guyacan, Program Manager, Responsible Supply Chains in Asia Program at ILO. Fredy, please.
Thank you, Marit, and thank you for all the participants as well as to the speakers for joining us today. As mentioned by Marit, well, my name is Fredy Guyacan and I work for the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia program, which is a partnership between the European Union, the International Labour Organization and the OECD, with the purpose of promoting responsible business conduct and socially responsible labour practices in supply chains. And necessarily working in supply chains, we work also with the lower tiers of the supply chains, which are mostly populated by micro, small, and medium enterprises. And as we know, many of them face different barriers in terms of challenges, in terms of informality. So they also lack the resources, human and financial, to implement responsible business practices at the enterprise level. Also, businesses in the lower tiers face barriers to access information related to rules and regulations linked to responsible business conduct, to CSR, and also to the labor dimension of RBC, responsible business conduct. And of course, this has a negative impact on the labor conditions of the workers working in these companies. Well, we know well that, I mean, right now, the majority of businesses are going through challenging times during this crisis due to the COVID-19. While many of them are struggling to survive. But at the same time, this is an opportunity to rethink and redesign policies, interventions, and services to support the businesses in the lower tiers of supply chains in order for them to start implementing social responsible labor practices. Building back better and also a human-centered economy necessarily means to support this type of enterprises and bring together also other relevant actors, such as government agencies, those in charge of supporting small and medium enterprises, as well as the agencies in charge of the promotion of investment and trade, but also, of course, trade unions, employers' organizations, business associations, think tanks, civil society organizations, as well as universities. it is increasingly clear for businesses as well as for the government itself that responsible business conduct and socially responsible labor practices are not a matter only of doing the right thing, but there is also a strong business case to do so, because it is related to increases in productivity in the companies, as well as increases in their competitiveness for them to remain linked to these supply chains and therefore access new markets and with the respective effects in terms of employment, economic growth, and sustainable development. So without any further preamble from my side, in today's conversation, I'll give the floor to my colleague, Marit. Over to you.
Thank you, Fredy. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce the speakers here. We're very pleased to have 6 very knowledgeable speakers to share their knowledge and experience. So first, a brief round of introductions. We have our first speaker is Krittika Wuttipat Aree, Executive Vice President for Strategic Initiatives, Compliance and Sustainability at Li & Fung Limited. Krittika oversees the business process transformation and implementation of compliance and sustainability across the supply base. Before Li & Fung, she was Southeast Asia and South Asia Regional Director of Sustainable Manufacturing and Sourcing at Nike. And earlier positions have included APEC, Organizational Development and Regional Coordinator, and Country Director for International Youth Foundation. Following this, we will hear from Asif Ibrahim, Director, Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Export Association, and Vice Chairman, New Age Group of Industries, which is a company that is in the textiles industry. Asif is as director of a Bangladesh garment manufacturer. He is responsible for textile sustainability and circularity projects, and he's also an executive council member of our UNESCO Sustainable Business Network, and recognized as he's a commercially important person by the Bangladesh government. He's also chairman of Chittagong Stock Exchange and the former president of Dhaka Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Following that, we'll hear from Walter Lin, Managing Director Asia in SEDEX. So Walter has 15 years of accumulated knowledge and experience on supply chain, including supply chain experience in manufacturing, international trade, responsible supply chain, and corporate sustainable development. And he is now managing the SEDEX operation in Asia, working closely with SEDEX members and stakeholders, including UN agencies and government and industry associations. He will explain more about that. Following that, we will speak with Patuan Samosir, Director of Trade Union Rights at the International Trade Union Confederation, Asia Pacific. Patuan directs the development and implementation of organizing activities in the regions and responsible for international cooperation with various international trade unions. He also observes, analyzes, and reports human and trade union rights violations and facilitates the development of international solidarity support. Following that, we will hear from Dorothy Lovell, Textile and Garment Lead at the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, where she leads OECD's work on due diligence for responsible supply chains in the garment and footwear sector. And she has also contributed to reports on blockchain and responsible supply chains, SMEs, and due diligence, among others. And she has prior private sector experience working on responsible supply chains in the sector. Finally, we will hear from Tulika Bansal, who works as a senior advisor on business and human rights at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, where she provides expert advice on human rights to multinational companies in various sectors to promote the uptake of UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And she has led and carried out over a dozen country-level human rights impact assessments in various sectors, including food and beverage, agriculture and fisheries, extractives, and the tourism sector, where she focuses on issues of labor rights, community impacts, and child rights. And she will speak a bit about that. So that's a brief introduction to our illustrious panel. So with that, let me first kick off with a question to you, Krittika. As a multinational sourcing from a host of countries in the region, what are the main challenges you face in ensuring socially and environmentally responsible business practices among suppliers in lower tiers? And what, in your view, are the root causes of non-compliance, and how can they be addressed? Krittika, I don't hear. Can you unmute yourself?
Myself.
Thank you.
Sorry. So generally, when we talk about upper tiers and lower tiers, we are talking about the differences in terms of traceability. Because when you go lower into the tiers, it's harder to identify the real actors or the rights holder in different tiers. So that's number one. In the lower tiers, we generally run into small and medium-sized enterprises. And to a certain extent, it could also be informal sectors. So in order to make sure that there is a level of adherence to international standards, or even the local law is getting harder and harder. Okay, so that's a general characteristics of why it is more complicated when you go down to the lower tiers. In terms of non-compliance root causes, I would divide it up by in two dimensions. One is the external factors. These are factors that are not within the control by the manufacturers. These are macro factors that influence the non-compliance issue or the ability to become compliant. So one external factor is the standards that has been expected has gaps with local capability. For example, environmental protection. We have a standards on how the wastewater should be treated before being discharged into a public waterways. But there are certain countries, communities, and industrial zones that have the law whereby all the wastewater streams from all the facilities will go into a communal or decentralized wastewater treatment plant to be treated before being discharged. In reality, in some of the countries or some facility, they do not have the right people with the right knowledge to do that, nor the facility is equipped technically to treat all kind of wastewater. So that opens up the issue. It creates a false understanding that there is a wastewater treatment plant, but it wasn't done properly, so it's discharged in the incorrect way. Number two, the external factor would be the misalignment or the absence of local law. Take, for example, we have a number of ILO core conventions that has been expected to be implemented inside the country. And we can see the whole gamut of things in, so many shades of how it's being implemented, from the country ratifying the conventions and use it in true spirit. We see countries that ratify conventions, but not really using it or in the process of doing that. We also see countries where they do not ratify the core conventions and do not do anything about it, or the country that do not ratify convention, but try to come up with local law that may or may not support the spirit of that actual convention. So if all things are perfect, we wouldn't have ILO doing annual review on declaration, fundamental principle or rights at work. And that is the gap that we need to also understand that it happens. Number three, in terms of external factor, is lack of enforcement or support system to enforce certain things effectively. And I think that goes without saying. Everybody knows that if there are certain compliance standard, international expectation that also have been supported by local law, it will make the enforcement much more effective. So where we have the law but enforcement is not effective, or there is lack of support system to make enforcement become effective, then it can be an issue. Take, for example, safety. Many countries have the laws whereby a boiler operator should be trained and certified by the government. And because it's hazardous work and it has lots of implication on occupational safety. But we also see countries where they either have the right people being in the government doing the training and certifying, but they don't have enough people to do that. Or the country that have that law, but the people that they have in place are not capable of doing that. And the last part in terms of external factor is lack of effective system or structure. For example, when it comes to labor relations issue, when there is a conflict enough to be declared as labor dispute, generally we will look at locally available labor dispute mechanisms available. And oftentimes we find that those mechanisms is not robust enough or effective enough, or the whole nine yards of the issues. And as you know very well, justice delayed is justice denied. And we have seen that on the macro issues in multiple countries. How to address these external factors is first start individually by us recognizing that there are gaps. Because unless you have that understanding, you don't develop empathy. And you need that empathy to feel motivated to be part of the solution. And since the issue is macro, it's not depending on one person or one player to be able to make the change. It has to come together as a band of people. And that can be people from public sector, private sector, nonprofit, labor organizations, all of us coming together and create the change through industry coalition. So that's the first part on external. In terms of internal factor, which is within the control of the manufacturers, what we often see as the root causes of that lead to non-compliance. Number one, lack of capability to manage, maintain, and improve compliance level. For example, every factory have human resource department. They definitely can do payroll, but not all of them are created equal. Not all the HR department is equipped to have progressive social dialogue with workers, with managers. And oftentimes when this layer of conduit is not working properly, you often see the issues around labor relations. Secondly, lack of communication or imbalance of power between players within the manufacturing themselves. For example, you have every company would have what they call a sales department. These are the people that go out there and try to get orders, as many orders as possible, and try to feed that back into production facility. And production facility will be managed by the factory manager. If the two departments do not have equal voice at the table, what we often see is the sales department will feed lots of orders, and that order may or may not be at the level that production can cater. And if the imbalance of power exists, what will usually happen is the production people will try their best to do whatever it takes to meet the delivery timeline. And that could lead into the issues like unauthorized subcontracting or excessive working hours. The third area for internal factor is mentality of factory management. I'm a firm believer that your action reflects what you think and your mindset. If you have two different factory managers who have different views on certain issues, how they manage the factory will look different. For example, how do they view values of the workers? What is their personal stance on respect to the law? What is their tendency to approach a problem. Are they trying to approach it constructively, transparently, or they tend to hide things? All of this will lead into non-compliance behavior that we might observe at the factory. And the last area that we see more and more is now we see the shift of the investment. So suppliers in country A is looking into offshoring more manufacturing plants into country B, C, D, because they want to take advantage of production factors within that locality. Then what comes with it is some of these suppliers have no experience in managing cross-culturally or cross-country. They may not have enough people to be able to do that, or they may not find the right local partner to help them do that properly. And that can create an issue. And in the long term, it also relates to when they start establishing their operations, then you will have foreign manager and local manager coexist. How do they work together? The dynamics between the two really means a lot in terms of a long-term compliance or non-compliance of the facility. So that would be how we can address this internal factor. So you probably, the simple answer to that is having the right people in the right job. If you do not have the people with the right skills in that job, you either acquire them or you train them up. There are certain skills that may not exist in certain country, and only training can be the answer. So the brands and the companies sourcing from those countries need to have awareness and be able to support them in terms of bringing them up and upskilling the right people to be able to carry out the work effectively. At the same time, buyers also need to have a framework that provide business rewards and sanctions so that it is very clear when you create market incentives for being compliant. That's all from my side, Marit.
Thank you so much, Krittika. That was really interesting, and thank you for bringing all these issues to life in such a good way and by giving examples. So I will move. We will do follow-up questions and Q&A later, but I will move on to our next speaker, Asif Ibrahim, Director, Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Export Association and Vice Chairman, UH Group of Industries. So Asif, Bangladesh is one of the biggest countries now for apparel production. As director of BGMBA and vice chairman of a leading exporter of woven and knit apparels, what progress have you seen over the years, and what are the main obstacles for companies in lower tiers, from what you see, to fully comply with environmental and social standards and guidelines? And how could it be changed? How could it be addressed?
Thank you, Marit. Today, actually, Bangladesh RMG sector is the front runner in transparency regarding factory safety, regarding value chain responsibility, and workers' well-being. A number of initiatives have been taken in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza disaster that I'm sure most of you are aware of, including the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh, the Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety, and the very recent Ready-Made Garments Sustainability Council. Each and every factory was audited and remediated in terms of fire, structural, and electrical safety through the collaborative support of local and global experts, foreign brands, and international development partners like ILO and the donor agencies. We also have made significant progress in the area of social compliance in factories. Bangladesh's ready-made garment factories and the industry has been ranked second in ethical manufacturing by QIMA and Just Style with a score of 7.7 after Taiwan. Uh, Not only the workplace safety and social responsibility, sustainability, but also the sector has made notable efforts in addressing environmental sustainability. Currently, we have 144 lead green garment factories certified by the US Green Building Council, where 40 factories are platinum. 39 out of the world's top 100 green garment factories are indeed in Bangladesh. We have also 500 more factories in the pipeline for LEED certification. All these achievements surely reflect the competence and sustainability stride that this sector has made over the years. In terms of safety and well-being, uh, as I mentioned, 100% of our factories are checked for building, fire, and electrical safety. 90% remediation has been made of Accord, and 94% remediation of has been made of alliance listed factories. These are already completed. The government of Bangladesh upgraded the Department of Inspection for Factories and Establishment, or in short DIFE. The total number of inspectors at DIFE now is 310. The total number of factory under DIFE now is 1,549. Out of them, the active factory is 811, and the remediation works like structural, electrical, and fire safety have completed 47% of active factories. The Remediation Coordination Cell, or RCC, it was launched in May of 2017 to oversee remediation of all factories under National Action Plan and those of the Accord and Alliance. The government has recruited 43 engineers for RCC. ILO actually provided us with 31 engineers. Bangladesh has also made big strides in terms of workers' rights and welfare. Labor law was amended in the year 2013 and in October of 2018. Labor rules were promulgated in the year 2015. Uh, Currently, the amendment of the export processing labor law is under process. Minimum wage has been increased by 381% since 2010, with a provision of minimum 5% annual increment. New minimum wage for unskilled workers is now at $97 per month. We have made each and every factory have elected workers' participation committee and safety committee. This has been made mandatory. A central fund for workers' welfare is created, where we have already started contributing fund. In the last fiscal year, we provided about $10 million, and this will increase with the increase of exports as these are correlated. Online registration of trade union has started, and the number of registered trade union before the year 2013 was only 138, and number of trade union registered after 2013 stands at 895. At central level, BGMEA is in continuous dialogue with labor federations, including Industrial Bangladesh Council, on a regular basis. To resolve labor disputes, BGMEA runs an arbitration committee headed by a retired district judge with representatives from 12 workers' federations. Since 1998, this arbitration mechanism has resolved 14,579 disputes and collecting $3.12 million from employers and distributing the same amongst 51,207 workers. Training initiatives. We in BGMEA, in collaboration with the government and development partners, are providing training among factory owners and mid-management officials on occupational safety and health and on social dialogue. BGMEA provides regular training programs on Bangladesh Labor Law 2006 and industrial relation for both factory management and factory workers, those who are members of the association. A training program on effective workplace cooperation and essentials of occupational safety and health, EOSH, is being conducted by BGMEA, BKMEA, which is another association for knitwear manufacturers, and Bangladesh Employers Federation, with support from ILO and ITC since 2014 to create a culture of OSH in the factory level. We are in collaboration with the government of Bangladesh, government of Sweden, Denmark, and ILO in running a project titled Improving Social Dialogue and Harmonious Industrial Relations in the Bangladesh Ready-Made Garment Industry. Also, we take very good care of our workers' well-being. We run 5 schools for the workers' children. We provide them with books and study materials. We have set up 12 health centers for the workers, which serves more than 60,000 patients per year. BGMEA is conducting 2 full-fledged hospitals for the workers, 100 bed in Chittagong and another 150 bed in Dhaka. A tripartite MOU has been signed in 2016 between BGMEA, eGender Health, and DGFP, under which about 120 factories are getting free family planning commodities. So as you can clearly see, that remarkable improvement has been made in the Bangladesh ready-made garment sector from after the collapse, the most unfortunate incident of the collapse of the Rana Plaza. But there are challenges, particularly during the for the lower level of factories who exist in the supply chain. Buyers are usually directly connected with the upper tiers of the RMG factories. The good examples that I mentioned to you are mainly consisting of the BGMEA member factories who are, belong to the upper tier. But we do have factories in the lower tier who are not under the, I would say, direct concentration and surveillance. So those are the areas that where we need to put our efforts so that international rules and regulations imposed by the buyers are governed as national policy and regulations, and those can be also implemented throughout this supply chain, particularly for the factories who subcontract. So let me just stop here, and maybe during the second round, we can discuss further. Thank you.
Thank you, Asif. And yes, looking forward to the second round, hearing a bit more on what is being done to address that. So we will now move on to Walter Lin, Managing Director, Asia at SEDEX. Walter, from the perspective of the SEDEX, what are the major challenges when it comes to promoting sustainability, both environmental and social, among micro, small, and medium enterprises present in the lower tiers of the supply chains that you work with? And why is it in their interest to include socially responsible business practices?
So thank you, Marit. Thank you for your question. For anyone who
I think there's a bit of a sound issue.
can you hear me all right?
Now it's okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, thank you for your question. So for anyone who is not be familiar with SEDEX before, SEDEX is a global business membership organization. We are working with international brands and retailers who are our buyer members but also the small and medium-sized companies who are our supply member. Regarding your question around the challenge and to promotion for sustainability, I'd like to share from two sides. One, I guess, is mainly from the supplier side, which is small and medium-sized companies. I guess for the SMEs, I think the most of, these concepts, sometimes we talk about response sourcing or response business. I think these concepts and terms can feel very far away and remote for suppliers because either they have never heard of things like response sourcing before, even they have, when we do the engagement with the supplier, they will find it very hard to understanding how these concepts are relevant to their business. So for these small and medium-sized companies, I guess the most familiar part for response sourcing or sustainability is around assessment and auditing. I think for most of you may know that auditing or like assessment is usually to be a demand or requirement from their customer. So many these small companies seeing completing an audit or assessment as something that's necessary for the commercial relationship, either to hold on to the existing customer or to win a new one. But actually, these suppliers, they don't feel like they need to take any ownership for the sustainability. So that's the first challenge we can see when we promote these concepts into lower tier in the supply chain. And the other bit, I think the other speaker mentioned around for small and medium-sized business, they got a challenge around, they got the limit time and resource to managing for the social responsibility because they don't have the same resource which they can spend on time on training or spend the time on developing the skill, or even they want to spend time on understanding the frameworks that can help a business to operate sustainability as large organizations. And also we need to understand that these lower tier suppliers in the global supply chain, they don't have the direct relation with large buying companies. So which means they might not have the same access as the direct supplier to get a training or guidance from the buyers. And also they are less likely to have funds available for any upfront costs. For example, investing in training or different equipment. So this is an ongoing discussion we're having with our members, especially from the lower tier of the supply chain. But also we need to understand one other challenge as well is like we know when a big companies or buying organization, when they want to promote response sourcing or response business conduct to their global supply chain, and it will sometime they will be passing additional administrative activities for supplier. For example, if a buyer organization, if they want to report the gender data annually, so which means they need to ask every supplier in a tier to report these kind of data again and again. So some of the suppliers have report back to us, they fear it's waste of timing, and then they feel quite confused and it's cost a lot of their time on that. So this is also additional challenges we got to report back from suppliers. From the buyer side, from the large organization side, I guess the most common challenge is around the visibility of their lower tier of the supply chain. So as we know, international buyers or big companies, they don't have a direct contact with the lower tier of the supplier in their global supply chain. So that's the reason it's hard also to get accurate data about the activities, practice, or people that are at work aside further upstream in the global supply chain. So this is become more even challenging if you got a global supply chain in different countries and across to different sectors. So this is the general common challenge from the buyer side if they want to promote and also the sustainability in the lower tier of the supply chain. And I think also probably, Marit, you asked another question around the benefits and how can we selling the benefit to promote the response business or sustainability in the supply chain. Based on my experience when I working with supplier previously, I guess the most fundamental benefit we can say, by doing so, you can meet your customer demand and be attractive to new customer. I think this is a very fundamental and basic needs and expectation from lower tier supply in the global supply chain. And other than that, we might also need to talking around better management system. So if you have a better internal management system, for example, you hold a better human resource, health safety, or environmental management system, which you might have a healthier and happier workers, that is linked to better productivities, and also probably have a lower rates of absence, illness, and injuries among workers. And the other side, because by improving the social and environment responsibility in the global supply chain, I guess the company can also get a benefit to get the competitive advantage among peers companies. Finally, I guess operating sustainability also allow a business to support their local community as well, because this will help them to build a reputation as a good employer. So people want to come to work for a company, and small business can also have a positive impact on society and contribute to development, and as well being more attractive to the future customers. So that's the general output and also sharing from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. And we will move on then to Patuan. Patuan Samosir is Director of Trade Union Rights, International Trade Union Confederation, as mentioned earlier. So Patuan, we all know that different sectors face different issues when it comes to the labor dimension of sustainability. From your perspective, what are the general main issues affecting workers in the lower tiers? I hear some noise here of the supply chains, and what do you see as the way forward, particularly at a time when traditional labor relations are being changed or challenged by the emergence of the gig economy, high levels of informality, and the future of work in general? I don't know if that was heard. I hear some noise, but Patuan, please.
Yeah. So thank you, Marit, and good afternoon from Singapore. And on behalf of the International Trade Union Confederation Asia Pacific, representing more than 60 million workers in 34 countries and 59 national centers, I would like to express our sincere thanks to the ILO for the invitation to this important forum. So I will be very direct to the question. So in my perspective, the general main issue affecting workers in the low tiers of the supply chains in Asia are the multinational corporations, which are also the global buyers, usually look into the possible lowest cost of the sourcing and production process. And with this kind of behavior, they attempt to drive the cost of labor to the lowest possible, and also denying basic labor rights and social protection. And indeed, this leads to the rise of the precarious work in supply chains, characterized by the non-standard form of employment, such as temporary and then casual work. Within the global supply chains, temporary workers have been estimated to represent 20% of the workforce among suppliers. I just quote this from the ILO Global Survey result in 2017. And indeed, the low tiers of global supply chains are normally in countries with weak regulatory frameworks that do not cover and protect workers, especially in non-standard form of employment. The nature of global supply chains in the lower tiers tends to exploit workers at the bottom. While global buyers profit massively, they are seldomly not held accountable for the labor rights violations within the supply chains. So, what are the possible ways forward? At the global level, the obligation to practice human rights due diligence should extend to all internationally recognized human rights, including fundamental workers and trade union rights as defined by relevant international labor standard. At the national level, we need to institutionalize regulatory frameworks with strong enforcement mechanisms that protect and uphold the labor rights for all workers regardless of employment arrangement. This is very important. So our organization, the ITUC Asia Pacific, organized various activities and campaigns to promote the applications of the ILO standard, UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights, OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, and also due diligence. We also support the joint global initiative from the International Organization of Employers, IOE, International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, International Labour Organization, ILO, and the global brands to catalyze action across the global garment supply chains. Giving an example, our affiliates in Indonesia signed a joint commitment with employers associations to protect safety and health, business sustainability, welfare of workers in the export-oriented garment or footwear sectors amid the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, we also invited to this joint commitment together with the ILO as the witness for this good commitment. I would like to say something like that. This is a very good commitment between trade unions as well as the employers association in Indonesia. At the enterprise level, Wakol Workers Union affiliated to the KSBSI Indonesia and the Wakol management, actually they work together to transform their production lines temporarily as to produce surgical masks during this COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, the company was able to keep their workers employed. With this, I would like to conclude that human rights due diligence should be informed by meaningful engagement with trade unions in a constructive dialogue. And of course, we need to shift the policy paradigm in the directions of the human-centered approach on the basis of the ILO Centenary Declaration. So I think this is from my side, Marit, and I hope it is very clear because for us, it's really, really very important to have the meaningful engagement with trade union in a constructive dialogue. I think this is one of the key for us to see as a way forward. Thanks, Marit.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patuan. Yes, I think very important with constructive dialogue. I'm sure that's something that we can all agree on. So let me move on. We will have more time in the second round, but let me first move on to Dorothy Lovell, who is Textile and Garment Lead at OECD Center of Responsible Business Conduct. So the OECD Center, Dorothy, has developed a series of due diligence guidance for various sectors, including for the garment sector, as mentioned, and these guidance provides practical guidance for enterprises on how to address, avoid and address adverse impacts related to workers, human rights, environment, bribery, consumers, and corporate government. So what does it mean for a company to do due diligence in its lower tiers according to the guidance? And what methods are companies encouraged to use, and some of the key innovations that can make this easier? Can you guide us a bit through that and perhaps give us some practical examples?
Thank you, Marit, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be joining this really important forum. And good afternoon, everyone. It's morning where I am here in the UK. So first to say, thanks a lot for the introduction to the guidance. Maybe just to say that this guidance comes from the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which is a tool and a standard that was adopted by 50 governments, which accounts for the majority, in fact, of international trade in many, many sectors. And this guidance being updated in 2011 was a great opportunity to bring it into alignment also with the new, at that time, UN guiding principles on business and human rights on this principle of due diligence. And so countries that are committed to the UN guiding principles may well want to look to the OECD guidance to support their actions, so to operationalize these principles. So, of course, the guidance recognizes the tricky nature of reaching these lower tiers of the supply chain from the perspective of the end of the supply chain. It's in fact really part of the DNA of guidance. So the due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct that was launched in 2018. And as Marit referenced, some of the different sector guidances. So I particularly work with the garment and footwear guidance. The way that the lower tiers are really put almost central in the guidance is that the guidance requires a risk-based approach for companies. So they should address risks and adverse impacts in their supply chain based on where it is most severe, not on where it is easiest to access. And this is a key principle. So of course that creates the expectation that companies need to have knowledge about tiers on their supply chain, which may be many, many steps removed and is very difficult. And we've heard some of the key challenges there. So visibility has been well represented by other panelists. Another key challenge in the guidance that is recognized is this point of leverage. So how one company can have influence over another company, and that leverage diminishes, of course, with the distance between the company and the location in the supply chain where the risks may be higher. Perhaps one example from the garment sector too, where that leverage can be influenced, is according to how contracts are in the supply chain. So you can find from a spinning mill may well be tied to a contract to buy a certain amount of cotton from its cotton suppliers, but not have a secure contract with its own customers, so fabric manufacturers. And we saw last year in COVID that the dropping of orders or reducing of orders can then have a very difficult impact on midstream suppliers as well as those lower the commodity lower tiers. And another key challenge is the lack of joint ownership and trust and dialogue mechanisms in the supply chain, which again has been well represented. But we, on the positive side, we start to see, I think, some good structures coming into place and hopefully uptake on this. So I think one good example could be, I think Asif could maybe talk to this later, but the relationships in Asia between different manufacturing associations in the Sustainable Textile of the Asia Region Network. So to really come together to think about actually what are the minimum standards we expect of our customers with respect to how they purchase from us. And that gives us the ability then to be responsible in due course with our own suppliers. So in the guidance, there are a few different mechanisms that are presented to help companies address these challenges. One, probably no surprise to you all, is traceability. But to be clear, traceability in the guidance comes in the identifying and assessing risk stage. But before that, a company should scope their risks more broadly, and it may not be necessary to have full traceability at that point. The point being that traceability being quite challenging, it's possible for companies to prioritize developing traceability where they already have assessed that there is higher risks in the supply chain. And this is why you often see traceability in certain commodities being developed. Another key principle of the guidance is this concept of working with midstream suppliers and with choke points. So it's about recognizing those points in the supply chain, which where there are key points of transformation of a commodity, for example, or stages in the supply chain that generally require fewer actors. And building on what Walter said about the importance of strategic and non-duplicative assessments, I think what's important from the guidance is this principle of assessing at those choke points, but it also assessing the management systems and the ability and capacity of those choke points, those companies, those points of transformation, to do due diligence upstream. And that really shortcuts, if you like, the need for traceability, because you can actually ask the choke point to provide traceability, and then you as a company, as a user of that material, can then trace to that choke point. So a really good example in the mineral sector is that at least 5 different industry initiatives in the mineral sectors have refiner and smelter assessments, and that assesses key red flag risk indicators for where they purchase their raw materials. And that, of course, is really transformative. And perhaps a new choke point that is kind of emerging is actually much closer to market. So you're seeing also in the mineral sector that organizations like the London Metal Exchange, but also in Asia increasingly different minerals exchanges, saying, look, we're only going to allow you to trade on our network if you can prove that you have got this assessment that's in line with the OECD guidance and the UN guiding principles. And this is a new trend. It's emerging and it's developing. We're not quite there yet, but I think it's really promising. And perhaps the final point I wanted to mention, I know I'm slightly running over my time, is the importance that none of this can be done without acknowledging cost sharing. And if we're really serious about doing due diligence, in the lower tiers, we've got to not place the burden of doing that, as in the cost burden, on those lower tiers that may already be squeezed in terms of the supply chain. So a company being serious about due diligence in the lower tier needs to put into its contracts with its direct suppliers, yes, we expect you to meet these standards, but we also want to join with you in meeting those costs, and we won't place undue burdens that we're not reflecting in our costing and our purchasing practices. Some innovations, just very quickly. Digital tools will surely help, and we see a lot of developments from distributed ledger technologies like blockchain, open data sharing sites like the Open Apparel Registry. All of this will help build transparency, but of course it doesn't replace the need for companies to also really do the boots on the ground work. And, you know, as people say, good information in, good information out. Sectoral collaboration, I mentioned an example earlier. I see this as an innovation. It's not a technology innovation, but it's super important that so competitors talking to each other, but across the supply chain and with trade unions. And we see examples like the ACT initiative in the garment sector, where trade unions, brands, manufacturers are working together. And due diligence legislation, finally, it's building on these voluntary efforts, and it's going to drive greater uptake. So long as due diligence legislation, and we're really pleased to hear that the EU mandatory due diligence law that's in the works, they're planning to align with UN guiding principles and with the OECD guidance. So long as the legislation is aligned, it should help drive uptake. I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dorothy. That was very rich and inspiring to hear about the different, and I think there's a lot of agreement probably around some of your last points, also around the cost sharing. I hear alignment here. But let me first now move on. This is very interesting, but we're already seeing the squeeze in time. So let me move on to Tullika Bansal, who is Senior Advisor, Business and Human Rights at the Danish Institute of Human Rights. So Tullika, you have worked with a number of companies on human rights impact assessment. which is a first step of human rights-based due diligence. So how can human rights impact assessment help assess impacts down in supply chains? And what lessons have you learned from working on it with companies across a range of sectors and countries in the region? If you could talk us a bit through that.
Thank you, Marit. So first, I wanted to mention, for those of you that are not familiar with the concept of human rights impact assessment, the UN guiding principles say that companies should assess and address the adverse human rights impacts. However, the UNGPs do not explicitly mention HRIA or human rights impact assessment and how to conduct one. So an HRIA is a context-specific process for identifying, understanding, assessing, and addressing the adverse impacts of a business project or activity on the human rights enjoyment of impacted rights holders. So this includes, for example, workers, including workers down the supply chain, community members, or consumers. And it's important to mention that this is an exercise that cannot be done from a company's desk at headquarters level, but that it involves and focuses on those on the ground that can be affected on the ground. And we have developed a guidance and toolbox on how to conduct a human rights impact assessment that is publicly available. So how can a human rights impact assessment actually help companies to assess their impacts down their lower tiers in the supply chain? So during the impact assessments that we have conducted over the past decade, we have always done a deep dive into the supply chains, also reaching the lower tiers, as what we see is often in those lower tiers where there are the most severe human rights impacts. For example, due to the informality of the workforce in lower tiers. One concrete example from the region is a human rights impact assessment that we conducted about 1.5 years ago with the UK-based company Reckitt, who is the manufacturer of Durek condoms. We conducted an impact assessment in Thailand and went down to the level of smallholder rubber farmers and tappers that work on the rubber farms, where the main raw ingredient for condoms are produced. So after speaking with the predominantly migrant rubber farmers and tappers, as well as other experts that are knowledgeable about the working and living conditions in the sector, and spending significant time on the ground, we identified some of the more systemic impacts of the rubber supply chain. One being that the current rubber prices are very low and that the farmers are not earning a living income. And in response to this finding and the HRA report that we published, Reckitt then joined the Fair Rubber Association, and as part of this initiative, will pay a premium price to rubber farmers in Thailand to create financial resilience and provide them with a living income. So this is one example, but having conducted many other human rights impact assessments with companies in different sectors, including food and beverage, extractives and energy, we have learned a number of lessons about the importance of human rights impact assessments. So first, what we learn is that it's about risks and impacts to rights holders and not about risks and impacts to the company. So it's important to identify those that are most at risk in the company's supply chain, similar to what Dorothy mentioned. So not those that are most obvious or easiest to reach. So for example, in the palm oil supply chain in Indonesia or Malaysia, which is a very large and complex sector, it's important to identify those regions and suppliers where there are vulnerable groups present, such as indigenous communities or migrant workers. They may be the hardest to reach, but also the most important from a human rights perspective. Also, a human rights impact assessment requires time, resources, capacity, and buy-in from the company headquarters, the teams on the ground, but also the suppliers that you will involve in the assessment. And these suppliers, especially if they're smaller ones, will need support and awareness raising to understand what human rights are and what a human rights impact assessment process entails. And for example, how it differs from other processes that they're more familiar with, for example, social audits. and that the benchmark for such a process is different, that it's about international human rights standards and not national law, and that it's not a one-off exercise, and that it's not a pass or fail exercise, but a process to really change the systems. Another important lesson, what we found, is the importance of monitoring and evaluation after an impact assessment, to see what has really changed on the ground. We did an impact assessment for a company in Myanmar back in 2016, and we went back 2 years later to speak to the same stakeholders and rights holders to hear from them whether the company had addressed their concerns or not. And this proved a very valuable exercise, both for the company, for us as the Danish Institute, and for the stakeholders in Myanmar. And as a last point, I wanted to mention the importance of transparency. We see that more and more companies are conducting human rights impact assessments, but the number of impact assessment reports that are published and are available in the public domain are still limited. They still remain internal documents. But publishing such reports is very important to increase accountability. And what we have seen is that when companies publish them, they actually help them to take concrete actions. Then a very final point that I wanted to mention, which is important during the current times that we're living in, is the emerging practice of virtual assessments. It's very important that assessments and audits continue at the moment during the pandemic as a part of companies' efforts to conduct human rights due diligence, and technology can play an important role in this. However, such virtual assessments cannot replace actual assessments, as they come with certain human rights concerns. For example, when you do a virtual assessment, can you actually reach those that are most at risk? Can you reach those that are most vulnerable and those that are invisible? Because maybe the technology cannot actually reach them. Also, there may be some privacy issues associated with it. For example, how are videos conducted? How is the data saved and stored? So as companies turn to this new practice, it's important to take these issues into consideration, but also not replace this with actual assessments when they're possible again. And for example, working with local partners and organizations that are already in country, as technology cannot replace the boots on the ground.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And I think it provides a very good insight into how human rights impact assessment can help address issues, and how it links to instruments like the OECD guidelines and the due diligence there. So let me now hand over to Fredy, co-moderator, who will give the second round of questions. And after which we'll have a short Q&A. We got a couple of questions, so I encourage the moderators to have a look at that, the speakers to have a look at that. But we hope to have a couple of minutes at the end for the Q&A. So Fredy, over to you.
Thank you, Marit, and thank you to all the speakers for these interesting insights. Because of the restrictions of time, I appreciate if we could keep the second round of answers short to 3 minutes. I would like to start with Walter Lin from SEDEX. What challenges have your members experienced in supporting suppliers under the current circumstances of the COVID-19? And how have you adapted the services you provide to support your members, both the buyers and the suppliers?
Thank you, Fredy. Thank you for the questions. And to keep it short, I guess the challenge, there are totally 4 challenges I can see. The first is around, even like Dorothy mentioned, about the visibility of the whole supply chain continue to be one of the biggest challenges, because this is not only a problem during a crisis like the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, the visibility became a very common challenges for international companies as well. So even in the COVID time, the visibility of the whole supply chain become much more difficult. The second challenge, I guess, is more around buying company. They cannot assume how a supplier has been effective, but the people they normally contact at the supplier to gather this information may not be at work. So we know many of our members has experienced this as setbacks because many of our members have placed people on furlough in the past 18 months, which means they are not be able to reach out to their direct supplier to understanding what really happened in the lower tier of their supply chain. And the third point is around without accurate data about how the supply and their workers has been affected, it's really difficult for a company to know what support the supply needs and what action the company must take to managing the impact on their own business. For example, the change in product availability due to a lockdown where suppliers are located. The final comment around the challenge, I'd like to say, because the pandemic is such a new and unusual situation, so there is no common approach to help business continue engaging with supply or all levels of their supply chain, or to identify the risk to supply caused by disruption. And obviously, as mentioned by Tulika just now, in-person assessment and site visit cannot be conducted. So virtual assessment, virtual audit are widely too common, you can see from the markets. Regarding the support, I guess we are a membership organization. So the most important is we provide quite a lot of like practical guidance through our website. So the small and medium-sized companies in our membership, they can still utilize these documents to really to understanding how they handle the difficult time during the COVID. For example, some of the guidance we produce, including purchasing practice and labor standards, but also the business and the people most vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic. And the other hand, we also produce some of the survey or the interview with our global members. So in January of this year, we analyzed data from around 1,000 suppliers directly to helping our buyer members to understanding the impact of their supplier might have experienced during the COVID. And the feedback is that the January survey shows that the financial support available for workers was very mixed, and also the government manufacturing industry still in particularly continue to be severely effective. And last but not least, and because Tulika also mentioned about the virtual assessment, we do provide the virtual assessment to support our members during the COVID time, although it's not perfect, but because the auditor, also the buyer, could not be able to visit the site. So using these kind of video technology, worker voice technology, we are helping our members to maintain the visibility of the supply working conditions and the practice. So I guess that's the general actions we can take. But in generally, I think during the COVID time, we need to work in not only with our customer members, but also with different stakeholders to working together to provide a support to get a visibility about the workers in the lower tier in the supply chain. So that's my comment on that. Fredy, thank you.
Thank you very much, Walter, for highlighting these challenges related to visibility, lack of communication, as well as the challenges to adapt to the new circumstances, and also the fact how the assessments as well as the collection of data can inform the services you provide to your members. I would like to pass to Patuan from the ITUC Asia Pacific, from the representing the worker side. And I would like to ask you, well, in many sectors, the lower tiers of the global supply chains are increasingly populated by informal workers, and particularly workers in the gig economy. So from the perspective of workers, from your perspective, what are the challenges encountered in engaging the workers in the formal sector, particularly in the gig economy? And what do you see in terms when it comes to representation and how to start engaging them at the country level? Thank you.
So thank you, Fredy. Again, I would like to stress out that more and more workers across the regions actually finding themselves in the precarious arrangement. I mean, with little certainty over the job security, their salary, or even their working time. I think this is the reality in the regions. So for the workers in the informal economy, they lack of access to the social protection, as most of them are self-employed. The bargaining target actually is not with the employers, but in most cases with local authorities. They also often in dangerous job, but they are not covered by the OHS standard. This is for workers in the informal economy. Then for the workers in the gig economy, I think it's quite clear there is a huge power imbalance between the platform and then the workers. The workers do not have any say in the rules set by the platforms, including the design of payment and benefits. There is also no room for negotiating their working condition. As the gig economy is new in many countries, it remains mostly unregulated. Under traditional labor laws that do not take into account the emergence of gig economy, the workers considered as independent contractors who do not have employment relationship with the platforms. This denies them the rights to minimum wages and social protection, for instance. And then the on-demand natures of the work also force the workers to work longer hours to reach quotas, unlock benefits, or reach a certain amount of income. While there have been organizing efforts among gig economy workers, they are unrecognized as union under the platform company because their freelance nature. However, with all this challenge, it does not mean our organizing work is worthless. Across the regions, our affiliates have expanded the organizing work to non-standard form of employment like platform workers. And in a number of cases, actually, unions have used collective bargaining to promote the standardizations of precarious workers. And of course, we here, as a trade unions, we also review and challenge the national legislations in terms of platform business. So I think this is from my end, Fred. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patuan, for highlighting the fact that workers usually don't have any say in shaping the rules and the conditions when it comes to labor in these platforms. I would like to pass to Dorothy from the OECD. As you know, well, many companies are now committing to net zero carbon emissions. This will involve working with lower tier suppliers in reducing emissions in the supply chains. But the question is how to couple those efforts on the environmental aspect to the advancing labor and human rights conditions in the supply chains, and how to establish some strategies and synergies to couple both.
Thanks, Fredy. Well, I think I see it as a bit of a spillover effect. So essentially, government targets to be in line with the Paris Accord on greenhouse gas emissions are being passed down to the sectoral level. And of course, you're seeing examples from UN climate change and also some national-based sectoral initiatives like the Swedish initiative on textile initiative on climate action. So that's actually creating a kind of traction amongst a broader range of companies. And of course, they can't achieve their targets without engaging the lower tiers. So the spillover effect perhaps comes in from the perspective of needing to build longer term relationships with factories that already perhaps have reduced carbon emissions. And we know that having short-term relationships and low costs and such is one of the kind of contributing factors to wage and job insecurity and wages, low wages. There'd also be shared investment and financing, and also you could imagine there being some greater economies of scale on this traceability question. So I see that traction being a contributing factor here to synergies. But on the other side, and just to mention, you know, there's going to be a great deal of disruption in supply chains. I mean, you can just see the example where more than 16 different economies have announced the phase out of internal combustion engine vehicles within the next 10 to 20 years. This is going to really mean that some supply chains will be scaled down, and there'll be new human rights risks associated with new commodity supply chains such as critical minerals, and also circularity may lead also to some disruption, need for disengagement on some cases in the supply chain. So it's just important, I think, to note that due diligence really as a tool will be really crucial in helping to navigate that and to actually mitigate the difficult impacts that may be associated with reorganization.
Thank you, Dorothy. Yeah, we hear you on this long-term vision in the partnership established between the buyers and the suppliers, as well as on the importance of traceability. I would like to pass to Tulika from the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and I would like to ask you on the synergies that can be established between the human rights impact assessments as well as on the environmental and social impact assessments in addressing issues in the lower tiers, and how can the lower tier suppliers be best supported by the information provided by these assessments.
Thanks, Fredy. I think it's important to mention that environmental and social impact assessments are often obliged by law in certain sectors and industries before getting approval or permits to proceed with the project. And human rights impact assessments so far are still voluntary efforts for companies to practice due diligence and to assess and address human rights. So there is a difference between the voluntary and obligatory nature of these two types of assessments. However, they have quite a few synergies. They all aim to understand the adverse impacts that a project or a company has on affected rights holders, and they both include consultation of affected groups, and especially the most vulnerable ones. However, environmental and social impact assessments don't always look at, for example, labor rights issues down the lower tiers of the supply chain. And human rights can then bring a benefit because the UNGPs say that companies should look at human rights across all their operations and business relationships. So applying that human rights lens would be definitely a value add. Gender issues are also not always adequately incorporated into environmental and social impact assessments, as well as legacy issues or cumulative impacts. So applying a human rights lens can be very valuable, and it can also be a value add for the companies and suppliers because it can actually save time and resources, and it can also avoid so-called consultation fatigue because workers and communities have to be consulted as part of an environmental assessment, a social assessment, and a human rights impact assessment that can be very burdensome. And integrating human rights into environmental and social assessments will also prepare companies for what is to come. Dorothy alluded to the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation and the developments here. And this is going to be a requirement going forward for the companies that are based in the countries where this legislation will come, but also for the lower tier suppliers that do business with these companies. So it's very important that the lower tier suppliers are made aware of what it means to apply human rights, what human rights are, and that it's not merely a tick box exercise. And Walter also mentioned this, that it's important to understand what is in it for them, for them to understand the changing human rights and legal landscape, and that what the demands are from not only the buyers, but also from consumers and investors. And here the buying companies have an important role to play to provide training and awareness raising, but there's also a role for other stakeholders. We can think of local civil society organizations and trade unions that already support workers, but UN agencies and national human rights institutions can also play a role in raising awareness and making tools and resources available for small and medium enterprises that will soon have to deal with the developments when it comes to mandatory human rights due diligence. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rika, for this answer and I mean for highlighting these synergies, especially when it comes to mapping the enlarged ecosystem of stakeholders and also mapping these affected groups, usually vulnerable populations, as well as including the gender lenses, as well as the assessment looking at the cumulative impact. I would like to go to our next speaker, Krittika from Lingfung. And I would like to ask you, how do you at Lingfung work with the major brands and retailers to integrate environmental, labor, and human rights issues in sourcing strategies? And how can companies ensure that price pressure from purchasing partners doesn't take away the financial space for suppliers to comply with requirements?
Okay, so for the first questions, I think it's important to understand what is Lean Fung. Lean Fung is our primary role is an agent. So we are representing brands and retailers in managing their supply chain. We are not, we do not hold final decisions, but we do work with them in the process. So how we can work with our customers who are brands and retailers at strategic level, we partner with our customers to devise the sourcing, compliance, and sustainability strategies. We give input to the supplier metrics, and we support them in implementing the planned activity that we have together. At operational level, through the network of our colleagues in various countries, we are acting as an extended team of our customers, specifically to compliance and sustainability. We are using risk-based approach to prioritize and advise our customers on where to prioritize their efforts and their resources. None of us have indefinite resources, then we have to put it where we create most impact. We also support our customers to help monitor, remediating, and capacity building the supply chain that they have. And we also work with our customers in terms of stakeholder engagement and also case management on the ground. So in terms of price pressure, I would, in my opinion, the price pressure to the level that people take away basic human rights, these are the symptom of a very weak system and wrong work culture. So I'm not going to generalize that every multinational companies out there are demons. There are different ways that we can manage our sourcing. So if you want to conduct your business more responsibly, I would suggest that there are certain things that you need to implement in order to ensure that you have the right work culture and system to support you doing conducting your activity more responsibly. Number one is aligning and integrating compliance and sustainability expectation to sourcing strategies. It cannot be a standalone, unrelated, nobody wants to talk to department in your organization. You have to have a common goals and objectives, and it has to be cascaded down to individual level, and we have to hold people accountable for meeting them. So this is not just, this is not a nice slogan on the wall, but actually we have a stake into it in order to make it happen in our organization. The workflow that you have, the core sourcing and merchandising workflow needs to embed compliance and sustainability as part of it. So there is no, you know, working around it. It has to be part of the workflow. Then you also need to create a clear governance system to balance the power between the sourcing decisions and also compliance and business, compliance and sustainability. How you can balance that, how you can create a transparent decision-making governance around that. It is very important to create that culture. Fourthly, the organization need to have a clear understanding on the values of sourcing from certain area. For example,
Krittika will have
if
few.
oh, we have to cut. Yeah, so you have to have the right system and being transparent, clear governance, and you have to select the right partner that you work with. Because if you cannot trust the suppliers you can work with, it would be very difficult to impact change and be a part of helping them sustaining the change, because they will be the one who also help us impasse the better management down to the lower tier of suppliers that they control.
Thank you very much, Krittika, for this answer and for highlighting the importance of communication and of the goals and the objectives and how to trickle them down to have an impact on responsible business conduct at the lower tiers. I would like to go our last speaker, Asif, from the Bangladesh Garment Manufacturers and Exporters Association. From your perspective, what is the role of brands in ensuring that companies in the lower tiers in the supply chains can invest and do invest in responsible business conduct? And how can stakeholders collaborate to ensure that issues are not only identified but also addressed?
Very good question. Brands play a very significant role here because they must ensure that there should be a guideline for the strategic collaboration between the upper tier and lower tier suppliers. The responsibility lies on them. There has to be written agreement of maintaining responsible business practices, which is needed while placing an order by the upper tier supplier to the lower tier supplier, and it has to be supervised and monitored by the brand. Formulation of a unified subcontracting guideline can also help in case of making the contract, because as we have seen throughout the discussions, many informal labor forces do exist in the lower tier of the supply chain. Due diligence of being compliant must be understandable by all the lower tier suppliers, and to create that awareness, brands must play a very important role. As low tiers follow the national rules and regulations, the government should also formulate policies or guidelines aligning with the international rules, which we are trying to do in our country. There has to be system for incentivizing factories that follow the compliance guidelines at the lower level of the supply chain. Let me just finish by saying that I think a question was raised about purchasing practices and how associations across the region can collaborate together. There are initiatives, ethical ETI is there, ACT is there. All the investments that has been made in Bangladesh factories, particularly I talked about the green factories, the LEED certified factories, all those investments did not at all result in any increase in prices. So that is our big challenge. If this kind of squeezing to the lowest prices continue, all the good efforts of trying to ensure environmental sustainability, human rights compliance, nothing will be possible to be continued, unfortunately. So the bottom line is the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Asif.
Thank you very much.
And
Yeah,
I'm
no,
afraid
we're
go ahead.
Go ahead, Marit.
We're afraid that we're running out of time. We're already slightly over time. We are getting some very interesting questions from on the chat, but we're afraid we might be cut off. So first, to start with, let me just thank all the speakers for your very interesting insights, and to the participants for being here and for posing interesting questions. I see that there's one question around just to kind of maybe take a couple of quick things. There's a question around how different is human rights due diligence from human rights impact assessment. My understanding is human rights impact assessment is part of human rights due diligence. I don't know if you want to add a quick word on that, Tulika or Dorothy.
Yeah, sure. Very happy to say one word. Human rights impact assessment is indeed the first step of human rights due diligence. And it's important to mention that human rights impact assessment then should be followed by using what comes out of the impact assessment to actually make changes. So for example, incorporating the findings of an impact assessment at the corporate level and adapting, for example, policies and procedures, and then using that to communicate on it. And it should be an iterative, ongoing process. Whereas a human rights impact assessment is usually an assessment that takes place in a certain time and place.
Thank you. We also have some questions around, we tend to assume supply chains are static or vertical, but they are often evolving or networked, and how we accommodate this more complex, realistic view when assessing lower tier risk. I don't think we have the time to get into it, but I think it's many of you are alluding to that, and that it requires the systems and perhaps sometimes also working with other platforms in terms of collecting information. But I don't know if anyone wants to add a quick note on that, or also there was a question around German draft for due diligence obliges national businesses to assess only second-tier companies if the German company has substantiated knowledge of possible violation. One of the participants were asking about if there's any views on that. I don't know if anyone of you want to give a very quick kind of word about anything like that. Otherwise, we will be probably cut off any second now from this session.
Marit, I'm happy just to quickly talk about the first question. So I think definitely due diligence and the engagement of midstream in all actors across the chain in taking responsibility for due diligence is going to help this situation. So you avoid this situation where a company says, well, actually, I stopped sourcing from that factory 6 months ago, therefore I'm not part of I don't have any responsibility with regards to that particular lower tier supply. That's a huge challenge, but it's a normal challenge, because it's true that companies do sometimes source and sometimes not source. So if there was greater ownership, particularly at the midstream levels, I think, and really working towards responsible supply chains versus individual responsible actors, this might help.
Thank you, Dorothy. Anyone else want to add anything before we wrap up? And I'm sorry sorry to all the participants also that we had to rush it in the end. Thank you.
Okay.
So we got the word, we need to wrap up.
Thank you.
So with that, thank you so much to all the speakers again, and to all the participants for a very interesting session.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.